West, at least in the United States, where I'm from, we only hear this perspective of people who defected from the Soviet Union. And this is actually a very small minority of people, but they come to the United States and they say everything was terrible in the Soviet Union. There was nothing good about it. When you talk to the masses of people who stayed there and you realize that they were actually terrified when the Soviet Union collapsed. They didn't want that to happen. In fact, there was a referendum held across the Soviet Union, and people overwhelmingly voted to preserve it. And when you talk to people who are still alive that lived in the USSR, they all say the same thing. Life was much better when we had free education, when we had free healthcare. People weren't starving. That's just like propaganda. Right. And the deficits, people always talk about, oh, people had to wait in long lines for everything in the Soviet Union. That stuff's completely overblown when you talk to people who actually lived in it. So I wanted to show
let's parse through that, because some of our audience is quite young, so they don't really remember the fall of the Soviet Union, because some of that did happen, but it was happening when Western forces were kind of stealing from the coffers of Russia before Vladimir Putin became president. So could you clarify sort of the timeline of when things did get difficult in the Soviet Union for people that might not know?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say it all kind of started from this period that is typically understood as the era of stagnation, which is the early 80s, the end of the Brezhnev period, when immediately when Gorbachev came to power. They call it the era of stagnation because the Soviet economy wasn't doing as well as it was in years prior. A lot of that has to do with the lowering of the global oil price that the Soviet economy heavily relied on to make money from abroad. But also there were real structural issues in the Soviet Union that needed restructuring, and that's no doubt the case. But there were different people that had different ideas of how to restructure things, and the people that wanted to go down the socialist path basically lost a power struggle. And Gorbachev came to power promising that socialism would be reformed by basically opening up free markets. And when that happened throughout the late 1980s, we started seeing the highest rate of deficits, the most shortages. That's the Soviet Union that the defectors remember. This time period towards the end when everyone was waiting in line for like basic necessities, which is because Gorbachev began this privatization of the economy. He started opening up a market economy, and the corruption that needed to be dealt with in Soviet society, that was a real problem. It needed to be reformed. It basically turned into a situation where these corrupt politicians that weren't dealt with were taking resources from the state economy and selling them on the black markets and making money and becoming the new capitalists. And that's why when people started going to, supermarkets that were run by the state, there were shortages all over the place. That eventually translated into the fall of the Soviet Union, where in the 90s, those people took over, and it was just even worse than the early 90s and the late 80s when when the Soviet Union was going down that path.